Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm a proud board member of the Victorian Society's New York chapter. Welcome, welcome. I'm honored to be introducing tonight's star. Keep in mind we have fantastic upcoming events. In fact, next week on Jan 23rd, we have a Zoom lecture about how pregnancy is depicted or not depicted in Victorian novels. And on Feb 27th, there'll be an in-person celebration at the Grolier Club in Midtown. That'll be about a new book about the Gilded Age photographer Napoleon Cerrone. There'll be links to that in the chat in a moment. And we've got other great spring events in the works, including there's a new book about Gilded Age fortune tellers. There's new discoveries about the 1839 Amistad Uprising and its connections to the New York area. And we're going to have details of all of that soon. So sign up for our Eventbrite and consider becoming a Victorian Society New York member if you're not already. And tonight's star, Brian Gallagher. I love when people just reach out to me completely out of the blue and say, I've made discoveries about something astonishingly beautiful in addition to astonishingly interesting. Can I come give a talk to your group? And the answer is, yes, we've been waiting for this. I love tonight's subject. So Brian Gallagher is Senior Curator of Decorative Arts at the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina, and curator and catalog author for the exhibition Walter Scott Lenox and American Belleek, which is on view at the Mint for a few more days that he's going to be enlightening about us in a moment. He has degrees from the Bard Graduate Center in New York and Drexel University in Philadelphia. He joined the Mint's staff in 2007, and before that, he served as assistant curator in the Department of European Art at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Among the exhibitions he has organized over the years and co-authored the catalogs include Classic Black, the basalt sculpture of Wedgwood and his contemporaries, and also Portals to the Past, British Ceramic, 1675 to 1825. Brian, I am so grateful for your gracing us with gracing our virtual stage and agreeing to speak this evening on these spectacular, underappreciated objects. So welcome, 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 Brian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eve, and good evening, everyone. I want to start off by thanking Eve for kindly organizing this, and Kate Culkin for all of her assistance tonight, and of course to the Victorian Society of America, of the New York chapter, to all you folks for giving me a chance to talk about Walter Scott Lenox and American Belleek, which, as Eve indicated, sadly closes in a few days on Sunday, January 21st. I'm going to be very sad to see it go, but it's been up for the last 4 months and seems to have been well received by our visitors, so I'm very grateful for that. Here we go. The south side of the lower Trenton Bridge, which spans the Delaware River between Trenton, New Jersey, and Morrisville, Pennsylvania, is emblazoned with the words, "Trenton makes, the world takes." They would probably be familiar to anyone traveling by train or automobile across the river at points immediately south of the bridge. The bridge's message, which has been manifested on one sign after another since 1935, developed from a citywide competition held even earlier. In 1910, the Trenton Chamber of Commerce sponsored a contest in which participants had to submit a slogan that heralded the city's industrial might, an entirely legitimate claim and great source of municipal pride in that era. The city's principal industries around the turn of the 20th century were iron and steel, rubber, and, of special relevance to tonight's presentation, pottery. Trenton's ceramics industry had grown considerably through the last half of the 19th century and into the beginning decades of the 20th. In 1860, federal census records indicate that Trenton was home to 4 ceramics manufactories that employed 155 workers in total. By 1909, those numbers increased to 34 firms, which now included decorating studios as well as manufactories, employing a total of 5,347 workers. During Trenton's peak decades, only East Liverpool, Ohio could offer the city serious competition as a leading ceramic center in the United States, and the skyline of New Jersey's capital was so liberally sprinkled with bottle kilns, smokestacks, and large brick manufactories that it became known as the Staffordshire of America. Staffordshire, of course, being that region in north central England that dominated ceramics production in the 18th and 19th centuries. For instance, Trenton-based Excelsior Pottery had 4 kilns when the Willets brothers, Joseph, Daniel, and Edmund, purchased it in 1879 to form their own company. 3 years later, Willets Manufacturing Company, about which we'll hear more later, had increased its factory site to include 11 large kilns, 2 small decorating kilns, and another kiln for miscellaneous works, not to mention 22 buildings for various aspects of the business. The company went on to become the largest ceramics manufacturer in Trenton and one of the largest in the United States. As you see here, the Willets brothers proudly featured their complex on the company letterhead. Walter Scott Lenox's life and career largely coincided with the period in which his hometown grew to dominate ceramics production in the U.S. He was born on March 29th, 1859, as the fourth of 5 children to Elizabeth Jane Lenox and Hiram Lenox, a Trenton hardware merchant. As a youth, Walter Scott apparently had little interest in following his father's career path and instead studied painting and drawing. By the time he was 16, Lenox, quote, thought of entering a pottery in the decorating department. Those were his words written later, figuring that a commercial enterprise would be a sensible outlet for his artistic expertise. He began working at a company called Trenton Pottery Works, where he apprenticed under Elijah Tatler, an experienced ceramics designer and decorator from Staffordshire, England, and from whom Lenox surely learned a great deal. Lenox worked at Trenton Pottery Works for several years and then tried his hand at a few other firms, but it was not until 1881, when he joined Ott Brewer as the director of that company's decorating department, that his career course seemed to right itself. It was also when his association with American Belleek porcelain began. Ott Brewer's origins date to 1863, and in its early years, the factory was primarily making utilitarian wares in white granite ware or cream-colored earthenware. Think midpoint hotel dinnerware, for instance. In 1875, the firm's partners, Joseph Ott and John Hart Brewer, invited academically trained sculptor Isaac Broom to join their firm. Broom was to be Ott Brewer's chief designer and modeler for the works the firm would display at the Centennial Exposition, a World's Fair that was opening in 1876 in Philadelphia. This photograph is from Ott Brewer's display at an exhibition in New York the following year, but the objects were the same ones Broom designed for the Centennial. Isaac Broom's sculptural works were not the only new offerings that Ott Brewer debuted at the 1876 Centennial Exposition. The firm also introduced its recently developed ivory porcelain. This ceramic body was Ott Brewer's first attempt at approximating the delicately thin porcelain being produced at McBurney & Company in Belleek, a village located in County Fermanagh in the southwestern corner of Northern Ireland. That gets a little confusing, I know, but it was in the country of Northern Ireland. McBurney & Company, renamed Belleek Pottery Works in 1884, had been producing its porcelain since 1863, and their wares had gained many admirers on both sides of the Atlantic. Belleek porcelain is a version of Parian, a ceramic medium that had been developed at English manufactories about two decades earlier. Parian has a higher percentage of feldspar in its composition than traditional hard-paste porcelain, causing it to become more highly vitrified in the firing process and thus stronger and more durable. The additional feldspar also gives Parian a smooth, marble-like surface that is typically a light ivory in color. Most of McBurney's products were created with the slip cast technique. Liquid clay, or slip, was poured into an exceptionally porous plaster of Paris mold. The mold absorbed much of the moisture from the clay, resulting in a delicately thin and lightweight cast. This photograph shows a mold from Lenox Incorporated in Trenton, but the McBurney factory would have been using similar molds. Although the Lenox mold was for a simple baluster-shaped vase that you can see there, the slip cast technique allowed a factory to create highly detailed and often very original shapes, such as this large nautilus shell on coral stand from McBurney & Company. Notice also this object's iridescent surface. The Irish factory coated its wares with a smooth, pearlescent glaze composed of resin, bismuth nitrate, and lavender oil. That glaze enlivens the surface of this nautilus shell on stand. The shell surface has also been partially tinted with a pink luster glaze, one of several colored luster glazes the factory occasionally used on its wares. The photo on the left depicts employees at the Belleek factory in Northern Ireland, preparing objects that have come out of molds to be fired in the kiln, and the photo on the right shows other employees painting objects that have already been fired. Not every Belleek product was slip cast, however. As illustrated by this photo on the right, the factory's greatly admired porcelain baskets were created entirely by hand. First, the clay, and any type of clay has a great deal of plasticity to it, malleability. Think Play-Doh before it's allowed to get to a leather hard state, and certainly before it gets fired. So that clay, when it's still moist, was put through an extrusion press to make thin spaghetti-like strands. The craftsman then formed the rods, each consisting of the same number of strands, and wove them to form the basket space. In other words, the same technique that basket weavers use for that base, the bottom of the basket. So for the basket on the left, the rods consist of 3 strands each, as I hope you can see. The base was then placed on an inverted plaster of Paris mold that was the same shape as the basket's interior for the end product. To make the basket's walls, the craftsman joined one strand at a time to the base and laid it in a downward direction against the mold. Each strand was curved in the same direction and spaced equally apart. After he completed a full rotation around the mold, he went around again, this time laying strands across the first layer at a roughly perpendicular angle. A few strands were twirled together to create a foot rim around the base's perimeter. The craftsman then moved on to fashion the rim, handles, flowers, and other components of the final product. When we last left Ott Brewer, it was 1876, and the firm had started producing an ivory porcelain inspired by Irish Belleek. Excuse me. Ott Brewer continued producing its ivory porcelain through the remainder of the 1870s, but never ceased its efforts to duplicate more accurately the Irish prototype. Success was near enough at hand by June 1881 that the factory published its experiments. In 1882, William Bromley Jr., a former employee of the Belleek factory, joined the Trenton factory. With his expertise, Ott Brewer got even closer to full-scale production of an eggshell-thin porcelain that compared favorably to McBurney's wares. Remaining difficulties in the manufacturing process were resolved once and for all when Bromley's father, William Bromley Sr., his brother John, and a few other Belleek factory workers arrived in Trenton the following year. Ott Brewer became the first factory in the United States to manufacture a Belleek-type porcelain, and it wasted little time in developing a wide variety of products in its new ceramic body. The company made various products that closely imitated or were strongly inspired by Irish Belleek pieces, such as this handcrafted basket, which is unusual because it is tinted a light gray, rather than left in Belleek porcelain's natural ivory color. With their supremely thin bodies and lustrous finishes, the components of this Ott Brewer tete-a-tete service, or tea service for two, fully embody the foremost qualities for which Belleek porcelain was so admired. Each piece's molded surface features a series of irregular, horizontal ridges or folds, a close copy of the Irish factory's tridacna pattern, as seen in the Irish teapot on your right. The tridacna pattern was inspired by the shell of a type of clam. That was the name of the species. The Ott Brewer set's aquatic motif is reinforced by its large mollusk shell tray, a shape that has no exact parallel in Irish Belleek porcelain. Each piece of the current surface is accentuated with turquoise luster, while the interiors are fully coated with a yellow luster. I'm hoping you can see that. And what I really wish I could do is hold up one of those saucers for you, and you would notice either of those saucers, you would notice a little smudge, black smudge in the center of the saucer, in the well where the cup would normally sit. And you might think, well, Brian, what is that? Is that a stain? Is that an imperfection? And then if I turn the saucer around to show you the backside, you would realize that what you were seeing as a smudge on the front was actually the factory's back stamp on the back. In other words, those saucers and cups and creamer and so on, those ceramic walls are so thin that you couldn't see through one side to what's on the back. They're that translucent. In 1881, just as Ott Brewer was perfecting its Belleek body and beginning to develop its Belleek offerings, the 22-year-old Walter Scott Lenox joined the firm in charge of the firm's decorating department. Let me just say that again. He was only 22, and he's now in charge of the decorating department at Ott Brewer. His timing could clearly not have been more auspicious. Unfortunately, factory records that might have identified the surface patterns or perhaps even new forms that Lenox created for Ott Brewer do not survive. But in his own words, as recounted in an 1899 interview, he, quote, created good designs and pottery that sold well. Perhaps then, Walter Scott Lenox was responsible for the coffee pot in the middle of this slide, or the potpourri jar on the right. Both objects illustrate that Ott Brewer was not only inspired by Irish Belleek prototypes, as we saw with the basket and the tete-a-tete service, but also, tremendously so in fact, by the type of surface decoration found on fashionable objects being produced at Crown Darby, Minton's, and Royal Worcester, all English porcelain manufactories. Those companies specialize in imaginative wares, like the Royal Worcester ewer seen here on the left, ornamented with colorful enamels and glazes, as well as flat and raised gold decoration. Ott Brewer and other Trenton factories followed suit, decorating much of their Belleek-type porcelain in a similarly ornate style. Some of those objects, again as manifested by the coffee pot and potpourri jar here, had physical features drawn from other cultures. The aesthetic movement was a dominant force in American decorative arts from the mid-1870s through the 1880s, when its adherents focused intently on creating works that were not only functional, but beautiful as well. Toward that end, artists and designers often found inspiration in the shapes and decorative motifs of other cultures, especially Near and Far Eastern. They borrowed and often freely mixed those motifs to create new, stylistically eclectic forms. The potpourri jar's lotus blossoms, rendered three-dimensionally with their leaves and stems applied to the jar, are a motif associated with Japanese art, as are the gold clouds sponged lightly on the jar's surface. The domed outer lid, with its scrolling vine tendrils and reticulations or pierced holes, shaped like medallion patterns on Turkish carpets, evoke Islamic ornament. It was not long before Ott Brewer's Belleek-type porcelain caught the attention of luxury retailers and affluent customers. These 8 dishes constitute half of a dessert service that was purchased in the 1880s from the New York-based Tiffany & Company by the Symington family of Newark, New Jersey. Robert Symington was a spool cotton merchant and lived with his family in a 3-story mansion on Military Park in Newark. Notice how there are different forms, square or round, footed or unfooted, and each plate or dish has been painted with a different flower. In early 1884, Walter Scott Lenox left Ott Brewer after only 2 years of employment there to join Willets Manufacturing Company as the new manager of that firm's decorating department. Like Ott Brewer, Willets began by producing white granite ware, especially hotel dinnerware, and utilitarian forms for the home. 2 years after Lenox joined Willets, and very likely with his urging, the factory started producing a porcelain body. During the same period, Willets hired William Bromley Jr., who you will remember was a former colleague of Lenox's at Ott Brewer, and before that, an employee of the Irish Belleek factory. Bromley, along with his father and others, had been instrumental in helping Ott Brewer perfect its Belleek porcelain body, and the Willets brothers undoubtedly hired Bromley to do the same for their firm. The factory's success in producing its new eggshell-thin art porcelain, as it was initially called by Willets, was realized finally in 1887. Willets, too, produced porcelain forms in imitation of Irish Belleek products, slip-cast shell-themed vessels, table shapes adorned with fully 3-dimensional putti, and handmade baskets and flowers. Surely one of the most spectacular examples of Belleek porcelain produced at the Willets factory is this mirror frame that mimics a wreath of branches tied together at the top and to which various kinds of flowers have been attached. And again, as I was saying earlier, those flowers are all made by hand. And to do that, first, every single petal of the flower is made individually and then assembled to create the full blossom, every leaf done independently, and so on. The picture on the right has perhaps come to represent American Belleek production more than any other form, as examples have been discussed or illustrated in various sources on American ceramics over the decades. It was almost certainly designed by Walter Scott Lenox and modeled by William Brownlee Jr. in 1887, the same year the company began its Belleek production. And I say that because one of those vessels, not this one, but another Nautilus, where is signed on the bottom WSL. And so that has led ceramic scholars over the years to assume that Lenox indeed was the designer of that form. Lenox was not the only gifted artist working for Willets Manufacturing Company. Brothers James and Thomas Scott Callagher became highly skilled decorators during their long tenure from about 1855 to the mid-1880s at Worcester Royal Porcelain Works. Concurrent with a good portion, perhaps as much as half, of the 30 or so years that James was employed at Worcester, he operated his own decorating studio nearby. His firm painted porcelain blanks that had probably purchased from a Staffordshire pottery, such as the plate seen here on the left. In late 1885 or possibly early 1886, the Callagher brothers immigrated to the United States, and by the end of that decade were working in Trenton for Willets. They stayed at Willets, by the way, for only about 2 years and then moved on. They bounced around from Baltimore to Boston. They were in Brooklyn for a while, but during their 2 years at Willets, they made lovely vessels like the two pieces you see here, or decorated, I should say, James decorating the vase in the middle and his brother Thomas Scott doing the ewer on the right. Like Ott Brewer's Belleek products, Willets Belleek forms caught the attention of high-end retailers. The visual appeal of this Willets tea set clearly convinced Davis Collmore and Company, a New York retailer and importer of high-end European goods, not only to include it in its impressive inventory, but also to feature it in a half-page advertisement. The set's pink luster highlights are a form of decorations employed regularly by the Irish Belleek factory, as we saw earlier with that large Nautilus shell on coral stand. Willets made its undecorated porcelain forms, or whiteware, available to anyone, independent decorating studio or artist, who wished to order it, and published a catalog in 1895 to facilitate that process. Seen here are 3 Willets vases that had been bought as blanks by professional independent studios, where they were painted by artists employed there. The urn on the left was bought by Sherratt Art Studio, founded by Samuel Sherratt in Trenton around 1879, and then relocated to Washington, D.C. in 1889. The urn's outer surface was signed by an artist named J.T. Baines. No other details about him have yet been discovered. The vase in the middle was painted by German artist Sigmund Werkner for J.H. Stouffer Company in Chicago. Werkner also seems to have been working as a decorator at Ceramic Art Company in Trenton, about which we'll hear more in just a second, around the same time that he painted this vase for Stouffer. The vase on the right was painted by an artist named Schindler at the Darcy Studio in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So the point I want to make here is that it didn't matter where these decorating studios were located. They didn't have to be in Trenton. Sherratt was, at least initially, but these others were in the Midwest. But because this catalog was available, they could order from that and have the blanks shipped to them. Excuse me. In 1888, the Trenton ceramics industry suffered financially. I'm so sorry, excuse me. I'm getting a sip of water. Willets Manufacturing Company reacted to the economic slump by suspending production of its Belleek wares, relying instead on product lines that were less costly to create. The Belleek suspension was temporary, but a frustrated Lenox nevertheless resigned from Willets in December 1888. 5 months later, he co-founded his own firm, Ceramic Art Company. He was 30 years old. His primary partner in this new enterprise was Jonathan Coxon Sr., who was from Staffordshire, England, and likewise had an extensive background in the ceramics industry. Lenox and Coxon had been fellow employees at Ott Brewer, where Lenox led the decorating department, as you heard, and Coxon had succeeded William Bromley Sr. as the factory superintendent. Lenox and Coxon had an ambitious vision for their new company. Ceramic Art Company would create pieces of high artistic merit in a Belleek-type porcelain body and nothing else. This singular focus immediately set the firm apart from Ott Brewer and Willets Manufacturing Company, which continued to produce white granite ware and cream-colored earthenware because a diversified product line with a range of price points helped them weather periods of economic decline. Lenox and Coxon rejected this model and purposely aimed at creating a luxury product that would attract an affluent, discriminating clientele. Ceramic Art Company was just as dexterous as its Trenton competitors in exploiting the Belleek-type porcelain body to create complex, even whimsical shapes. Note, for instance, the handle mimicking a blossoming bow on the leaf-shaped bowl seen here on the left, or the carp molded in low relief around this chocolate pot's bottom and across its lid. The pot's marine theme is reinforced by the lid's finial, shaped like a cresting wave, and the fantastic sea creature formed by the handle and spout. Lenox's company is probably even better known for the superb quality of its surface decoration, thanks largely to the consistently high caliber of painters and gilders that he employed. Regrettably, many of their names are unknown to us, and even many of those we do know remain mysteries in terms of their artistic backgrounds and other pertinent biographical details. The vase on the left was painted by Frederick Sturgis Lawrence, who, according to company records, worked at Ceramic Art Company from 1893 to 1898. He then went to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was employed as a decorator at Rookwood Pottery, the premier American art pottery, until 1904. While at Ceramic Art Company, Lawrence seems to have specialized in monochrome cobalt blue paintings like the one seen here. The central reserve on the middle vase was done by German-born artist Antonin Heydrich. He worked at the factory through the 1890s. And finally, the portrait of Marie Antoinette on the right-hand vase was painted by Czech-born Hans Nosek. Nosek's design source was a print after the 1783 painting Marie Antoinette with a Rose by 18th-century French artist Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun. Nosek and Heydrich were two of the many foreign artists hired by Walter Scott Lenox to lend their talents to his firm's decorating studio. The painted scene of a monk in a wine cellar on these tankards is after a painting by 19th-century German artist Eduard von Grützner. There are subtle differences: the stone floor, the monk's eyebrows, the string around his waist between the two tankards, which can be at least partly attributed to the fact that they were decorated by different factory artists. The tankard on the left is signed by Spanish artist Eugene Delon, while the one on the right bears the signature of R.H. Martin. Both artists worked in Ceramic Art Company's decorating studio, where they must have had access to prints of Grützner's genre paintings. Ceramic Art Company would occasionally arrange to have one of its Belleek objects painted in-house and then shipped to a silver manufacturer, where it would be fitted with silver mounts or overlay decoration, or silver deposit is what it was called at that time period. This cognac-colored decanter set left Trenton with a solid brown color only, albeit an appropriate color given the function of the set. Based on the back stamp on one of the cups, the set's overlay is attributed to DePass Manufacturing Company, a New York silver manufacturer that operated from 1909 to 1915. DePass provided the set's principal decoration. Each individual piece is covered with an intricate and finely detailed spider web, complete with its frightfully large inhabitant closing in on its hapless prey, a little fly. Like Willets, Ceramic Art Company produced catalogs to encourage independent artists and studios to purchase the company's whiteware for their own decorative purposes. Ceramic Art Company released its first catalog in 1891, just 2 years after the company was founded, and then published an expanded catalog in 1897. In 1909, a third catalog was made available. Ceramic Art Company introduced this vase form at 21.5 inches high, the factory's tallest, in its 1897 catalog. The current example, with this mythological scene wrapping around the vase's surface, is signed by an artist named Mary Brent. No additional biographical details are currently known about her, but she almost certainly painted the vase outside the factory. Both men and women painted on already fired porcelain blanks, but the former were more likely to be doing so as employment, including teaching china painting to others, while the latter mostly pursued it as a creative pastime. That female china painters, commonly described as amateurs in contemporary accounts, had far fewer opportunities than their male counterparts to be professionally employed was a reality of the day. Nevertheless, by 1893, more than 25,000 American women were engaged in this activity. In the early 1900s, Ceramic Art Company began producing elegantly decorated dinner services. These sets were in high demand among the company's wealthy, fashion-conscious customers, as well as high-end retailers, such as Tiffany & Company in New York, Marshall Field & Company in Chicago, and Bailey Banks & Biddle in Philadelphia. These 3 plates, for instance, are part of a set that was ordered by Bailey Banks & Biddle. Each plate is painted with the unique cluster of roses by William H. Morley, a gifted artist who had emigrated to the United States from England, arrived in Trenton around 1900, and enjoyed a long, distinguished career at Ceramic Art Company for more than 3 decades. Morley is also responsible for the decoration on these plates, likewise part of a bigger service. Unlike the pink bordered plates we just saw, however, this gold bordered set was not sold through a retailer, but rather was a private commission. Wealthy Trenton businessman Charles G. Roebling ordered the set almost certainly as a wedding present for his daughter Helen, who married Philadelphia artist Carol Sargent Tyson on October 16, 1912. The couple met when Tyson was asked to paint her portrait, which you see here. Helen's monogram, HR, appears at the top of each plate. If you're thinking, I recognize that name Roebling, well, sure enough, Charles Roebling is the son of John Roebling, whose company designed and built the Brooklyn Bridge, the largest cable suspension bridge in the country. And then they built other suspension bridges as well and perfected that technique. But they were an illustrious Trenton family, and that's where the company was located. On a much sadder note, I just wanted to mention that Helen and her fiance, Carol Sargent Tyson, were originally intended to get married in April or the spring of 1912 and had to delay their wedding to the fall of that year because Helen's brother was on the Titanic. And so the family went into mourning for 6 months or so, and thus her wedding was postponed. Ceramic Art Company's dinner and dessert services were marketed as Lenox China. As Lenox China quickly became the predominant part of the firm's business, it was perhaps inevitable that the company's name should allude to it, not to mention overtly reference the individual who had always been the company's driving artistic force. Thus, in 1906, Ceramic Art Company officially changed its name to Lenox Incorporated. And ironically, Walter Scott Lenox vehemently fought against introducing elegant dinner services at his company when his underlings were encouraging him to allow that, because other companies were doing it at the time and making nice profits from it. And he finally relented, and we now are seeing some results of Ceramic Art Company's dinner services. But Walter Scott was not in favor initially. During the same period of the company's history, Walter Scott Lenox's eyesight began to deteriorate. No longer able to supervise the daily operations of his designers and decorators, Lenox handed those responsibilities to the young but talented Frank Graham Holmes. Holmes joined the firm in 1905 to create designs for the company's tableware services, but with Lenox's compromised abilities, he was soon appointed chief designer. Holmes, along with other key staff members, helped lead the company in its new direction, although Walter Scott Lenox retained a nominal role in the firm's management until his death on January 11th, 1920. And I hope you can see that bust on the left is on the top of the bookcase in the photograph in the back of the photo. Although the following passage comes from the introduction in Ceramic Art Company's first catalog, one could argue that its sentiment must have been shared by the management of all three American Belleek makers, Ott Brewer, Willets, and Ceramic Art Company, that benefited from Walter Scott Lenox's talent and vision. It has been our aim and ambition to create a class of artistic ceramics that would merit the distinction of high esteem, in that they might be treasured not only for their beauty and present worth, but for their prospective value to posterity as legitimate works of art. It is my contention that these companies magnificently reach this goal, and my hope that after seeing some highlights from this exhibition, you agree. Thank you very much.
Oh, Brian, they're all so beautiful. Oh my gosh, can we just we could scroll back just so I my mouth's watering. Oh my God. I'm sorry, everyone. I have to get on Live Auctioneers right now. I have to bring some of this. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
I
thank you.
had no idea how many styles. I had no idea how eclectic they became. I had no
Yeah.
idea the range of the work. It's amazing.
Well, as I said, when these factories start off, the aesthetic movement is reigning supreme in American art and design. But as we get closer to the 20th century, that falls away. And so you see with Ceramic Art Company that they are getting into decoration where the entire porcelain surface is now covered with these beautiful jewel tone glazes. And it's all about the finely painted images and gold relief decoration and so on. So yeah, I love these objects.
So I've got tons of questions, and anyone
Okay.
who wants to unmute and ask their question, just raise your hand. What have been some of the reactions to the show?
Oh, thank you. Well, I think it's been very well received. In fact, I just gave a tour to about 25 people last night, and they really enjoyed it. That's been the reaction whenever I've given a tour. We had a nice write-up in the Charlotte Observer, our local newspaper, as well as in Art and Antiques magazine that was actually back in September. The way the Mint works in terms of its special exhibitions is that almost always anyway, is that they are free with museum admission. In other words, they're not a separate cost. So we don't really have a way of tracking how many people are coming to see any exhibition, including this one. But I certainly have, anecdotally received many favorable comments about it.
And I mean, there must be people who didn't think they liked this material, who walked in and then were just wowed by the sheer beauty and variety. Kate, did you have a question you want to unmute?
Yes, thank you so much. I loved it. I was wondering if you had a sense if like the archives have shown you or other research has shown you like sort of how people displayed this in their home and what it meant to people who purchased it.
Wow, that is a good question. And sadly, I did spend some time in the Lenox archives, which are located at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. And I did not come across that type of material. In fact, it was a little frustrating because they do have their sales books available with, of course, handwritten notes as to, what got sold on a particular day. But it's an extremely abbreviated description. It was virtually impossible for me or for anyone to understand from the references in Lenox's company sales books who was buying these things, and there certainly were no photographs available as to how people displayed these in their homes. What I could say is that when we get to the dinnerware, let me advance there. These services, for instance, these would have been almost certainly displayed in an elegant cabinet in the dining room of the owner's home, and then taken out when they were throwing a lavish dinner party. But they would not have been eaten off of. The hosts and hostess of the dinner party would have put one of these plates at every place setting around their table, so that they were already in place when their guests arrived. The guests would ooh and ah, and then these would be quickly, swept away, and people would then eat on a much plainer dish. So there are no knife marks on these plates, thank goodness. So I think we're obviously talking about America's Gilded Age. American Belleek was absolutely a ceramic medium that was considered a luxury product, and as I mentioned, Walter Scott Lenox was absolutely intending to cater to the highest echelons of American society. So I think we can assume that ornamental forms like vases and so on might have been displayed on a sitting room mantelpiece or on side tables, absolutely meant to impress guests.
So with your expert eye, right, if something comes on the market that's generically labeled, can you immediately tell that it was an amateur working on who bought a blank versus an in-house painter? Is that immediately obvious to you?
Well, I would cheat and turn the object upside down, and I would look at an image of the upside down at the bottom of the object, because especially in the case of Ceramic Art Company, they actually used a different mark for their blanks from the one that they use for factory decorated ware. So that makes it pretty easy. And actually, Willets had a different mark as well. That usually means it was decorated outside the factory. It's not a science. There are exceptions, but in general, you can at least start by going with the mark. And we do know some names of these, especially with Ceramic Art Company, not so much with Willets and definitely not with Ott Brewer. But with Ceramic Art Company, we do know some of the names, and I mentioned them: Hans Nosek and William Morley and Antonin Heydrich and others. So that gives some guidance as well, I think. The other thing I would say, actually, to be perfectly honest, I forget where I had it. Sorry, where was my talk? There it is. One thing that, and I'm going to say this is kind of anecdotal on my part at this moment. I haven't dived deep into this, but what I will say is that many of the pieces decorated outside the factory have themes and even palettes that you don't necessarily see decorated in the factory. The material decorated in Ceramic Art Company is actually fairly conservative, precisely because we saw highly naturalistic flowers, or a portrait of Marie Antoinette, or other the German artist who does monks. Walter Scott Lenox was very aware that the American elite around the turn of the 20th century, they were looking to proclaim their own wealth and cultural sophistication by usurping, if you will, design and art that had been made centuries before in Europe, and therefore older. And so they would want to order from these ceramic factories pieces that in general reference that older style, or that older taste, if you will. So the pieces outside the factory, where like this vase painted by Mary Brent, where they were allowed to be a lot. I think there's a greater freedom here. It's perhaps not as precise, and or what is the word? Not the design perhaps isn't as crisp as the flowers or the portrait of Marie Antoinette. But I think you see a kind of a lighter treatment of the paint and lighter pastel colors. If I saw this on eBay, I would assume this. I bet this was decorated outside the factory until proven wrong otherwise.
I'm finishing a book about a circa 1900 journalist, and when she was desperately unhappily married in the 1880s and 1890s, to amuse herself, she helped run the ceramic club in Wichita, Kansas, and they describe some of the patterns that these women used. And there's lots of cupids stabbing each other with arrows, and I think they're expressing some inner rage there.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah. The ethnic variety, Brian, is fascinating.
Right.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Exactly. Well, and as I'm sure everyone in the audience knows, the late 19th century is the time of great waves of immigration to the US, the Irish wave. My ancestors were in that. Germans, Italians, Swedes. And so, of course, it makes sense that among those thousands and thousands of immigrants are going to be people who are artistically talented or have worked at ceramics factories in their homeland and are bringing their skills and talents with them, and then being hired by companies in Trenton, companies in Brooklyn and elsewhere. In the case of William Bromley, the Bromley Jr. and Sr. from the Belleek factory in Northern Ireland, I think that was a more directed invitation. That Ott Brewer knew it needed some help from the people in the Irish factory to get their Belleek type porcelain up and running. But I think many of these artists were just coming over anyway to the US in search of a better life and livelihood, and they landed at some of these factories for employment.
I think in the glass world there were more hazardous ingredients in the air, right? With all the iridescence that they're trying to induce. Is your sense that the ceramic factories were slightly better, slightly safer workplaces than other industries at the time?
That's a good question. Well, they certainly are aware of the peril of lead glaze at this point in the ceramics industry, just in general. So I think that becomes less of an issue. And I think, well, what I didn't show an image of, because it kind of is immediately after the time period covered by the exhibition, is the Lenox factory that was built a year or two after Walter Scott died in 1920, so early 1920s factory in Trenton. And that looks pretty modern with lots of light, lots of natural light, lots of windows. It looks like a factory that we would see in our own lifetimes. So I think they were becoming more and more aware of what it meant to have safe conditions for their workers.
Have any descendants of the Lenoxes or any of the workers or designers, has anything surfaced that you know of? That because
no, sadly, well, Walter Scott Lenox was a lifelong bachelor, so he had no heirs. And I haven't heard of. Well, let me take that back. The Callahills, who I mentioned, James Callahill and Thomas Scott Callahill, their sons are talented artists as well. They don't work in the ceramics industry, but they do work in other ways in the US as practicing artists. Henry Walters, whose name and whose collection, I should say, gave birth to what is now the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, amassed this very large collection of Asian porcelain, which is, of course, now in the museum named after him. And at one point, he wanted to publish that collection, and he hired James Callahill and James's at least one son, maybe two, I forget, to paint each vase as an insert in the volumes of the Walters catalog. So So that's one family where I know at least one generation continued in the family practice of being artists. The other thing I should just mention, this isn't really answering your question, is so we already heard that, Walter Scott dies in 1920. Ott Brewer and Willets have actually already closed by then, so they don't last as long as Walter Scott's lifetime does. In 1929, the finally actually oh well I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. In 1929, Belleek Pottery Works, that Northern Ireland company that started it all, they finally take actually an Ohio company, not a Trenton company, but an Ohio company that was still making a Belleek type porcelain, to court. And the outcome of that court case was that no US company, none in Ohio, none in Trenton, could any longer use the term Belleek in its marketing materials or in its backstamp. And what I should have said before is all three of the companies I discussed tonight, Ott Brewer, Willets, and Ceramic Art Company, were doing just that. They were absolutely cashing in on, if you will, the cachet of the Northern Irish factory and using Belleek in their marketing materials and in the backstamp. The factory marks literally have the name of the company, Ceramic Art Company or Willets, and somewhere above it or underneath it on all these pieces is the word Belleek. So once that 1929 court case is settled, that basically sounds the death knell for all the companies that are still making a Belleek type porcelain at this point. Having said that, I would hazard to say that, to be honest, probably in the coming years after 1929, it would have died a natural death anyway, because now we're getting into the Art Deco style, Art Moderne, think Fiesta ware. People aren't interested in highly gilt, jewel tone rich pieces anymore, which require special handling and special protection. They want dinner services and other things that aren't so fussy, if you will. And so honestly, even if that court case hadn't taken place, probably this type of material anyway would have fizzled out in a few years.
Did the mint must have acquired stuff in the build up to this show?
Well, thank you for asking that. To be honest, the genesis of this exhibition, and here's true confessions, most of my big projects at the Mint have focused on our wonderful collection of British ceramics. Eve mentioned this exhibition, for instance, Classic Black, the basalt sculpture of Wedgwood and his contemporary. So I was focusing a lot on our British ceramics and actually a lot on our North Carolina pottery collection, not so much on our American ceramics, non-North Carolina American ceramics. And we have a gallery on the top floor of our building where we have on view, it's a permanent collection gallery, where we have on view American ceramics, including one case that featured about 7 pieces or so of American Belleek that are in our collection. A Willets basket, a Lenox plate, and some other pieces. And honestly, every time I walked by that case, regardless where I was headed or how quickly I had to get to that point, this case would draw me up short. I am not exaggerating. This is not hyperbole. I just love those objects so much that finally the light bulb went off and I thought, I just have to dig into this material more. And so, as I say, we already had some pieces, knowing that this, once I started researching this exhibition, we acquired a few others, which I'm very pleased to say. And so the checklist features about 80 objects. About 10 of them are from the Mint's collection. So we do have some of the objects from our collection in the exhibition and in the catalog. And since the exhibition opened, I'm even more pleased to say that several of the private lenders have graciously, generously offered to leave some of their loans behind as gifts to the museum. So our collection will have more Belleek objects in its permanent collection in just a few days after the exhibition closes.
I love that. I swear. Yes, once somebody has lent something and they realize they can live without it, and see people reacting to it, and
Yeah.
they've moved around other stuff on their mantle anyway. I've heard the stories from curators before. Once it's out of
Right.
the house and they realize that it's a gift to the public,
Yeah.
they think that maybe it should have a public stewardship.
Yeah,
Do you-
I thank you, Eve. I think you're right that they are pleased to know that people are enjoying their works. So I'm grateful that they agreed to let some of them stay behind.
have you bought anything that for personal study
Me
over the
personally, well, it's not that I wouldn't be tempted, but we have what's it called? Kind of a professional conduct guidelines, if you will. Every museum does, and it's considered not really ethical for a curator to collect personally in an area that he or she is responsible for in that museum's collection, because it creates the potential of conflict of interest. If I were developing a Belleek collection myself and I see a wonderful object come up on eBay is a legitimate source for this material, actually. It would be challenging myself to think, okay, do I really want to buy this for myself, or do I let my chief curator know that we should buy it for the museum? So we just eliminate that possibility and say, yeah, while you're on staff, try not to collect in an area that you oversee.
the curators that I know have bought something that's badly damaged.
That's okay.
That doesn't have market value but has research value, right?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Absolutely.
Yeah. And my last question, and then let everybody go about their busy evenings. You mentioned when before the talk started that you've got more mysteries to solve. What are some of the mysteries you're still hoping to solve?
Oh, well, there absolutely is more to be done, I think, with this topic. And for one thing, I just want to get back to those Lenox archives and plumb through more documents there than I had an opportunity to do before. I was mentioning to Eve before we started that I would really like to get to the Tiffany and Company archives. I did not get a chance to do that for this exhibition, and see if I can uncover more examples of American Belleek porcelain that Tiffany and Company bought directly from these factories to then sell in their showrooms. You saw some of those instances. So, and I'm sure there are many more. I'd also like to dive into to some of the artists that are represented or that were fairly prolific working for some of these factories. William Morley, as I mentioned, worked there for 30 years, a ceramic art company, and really just try and get a sense of an individual artist oeuvre. And I think there might be some merit in that. See how their style changed or the variety of objects that they painted. So I think there's a lot more to be done, and I'm looking forward to diving in.
And so one last thing. So when you're on your next trip to New York, we have there's a beloved Victorian Society adjacent institution called Fish's Eddy.
Oh, huh?
Which is this dinnerware place.
I've been there years and years ago when I lived in New York. I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so upstairs, the owner has her museum collection, as she calls it, because she and her ex-husband, when factories were closing down, were driving all over Tarnation, picking up, literally taking home ledgers and this kind of thing. She's got stacks of ledgers which have patterns in them, and she's got stacks and stacks of prototypes. And we're going to go through. Okay, and you're going to get 12 different research projects going for just.
Okay, wow, I had no idea. Thank you so much for telling me about that.
We'll get you set up for a lifetime's
worth
of articles and lectures.
I will be there for sure.
Yes,
thank you.
Okay, you're on. Thank you so much. What was the exact phrase? It's value to posterity.
Let me turn my page back over.
Okay.
With their prospective value to posterity as legitimate works of art.
Legitimate works of art. I think you've really made a wonderful, wonderful tribute to these legitimate works of art. Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. We've got compliments pouring in on the chat. Fabulous.
Well, thank you all. Thanks, Eve. Thanks, Kate. Thanks everyone out there for your time tonight. If you ever get to the Mint, look me up. I'll be
okay. You're on. All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Take care.
Bye now.
Good night. Take care.